Hello everyone, in this video we are going to build a WireGuard VPN server on a Linux VPS. WireGuard is lightweight, fast, and not too complicated to configure, so it is a great choice for personal VPN setups or remote access scenarios. In this video, I will use the deployment model and configuration information shown here. On the right side, we have the Linux VPS, which will act as the WireGuard VPN server. On the left side, we have the client, which can be a laptop or a smartphone. The information, such as public IP, network interface, WireGuard interface, and VPN IP address is already shown in the diagram. When following this tutorial, make sure to replace these values with your own VPS and network information, because the IP address and network interface name may be different in your environment. Now, let's move on to the installation and configuration steps. First, connect to your Linux server via SSH, or use the direct console from your VPS provider's control panel if it is available. Next, update the package list on the system to make sure the server can download the latest available versions from the software repositories. After that, install the required tools for configuring the WireGuard server, including WireGuard itself and the components needed to handle network rules on the system. Next, install WireGuard on the Linux server. This is the main component that allows us to create and manage the VPN tunnel on the server. Once the installation is complete, you can check the installed WireGuard version to confirm that the installation was successful. If the output shows the WireGuard version information, it means WireGuard has been successfully installed on the server. Before moving on to the configuration part, let's check the server's public IP address and network interface name. This is the server's public IP address and network interface name. Copy or note down these two pieces of information because we will use them in the next configuration steps. Next, we need to enable IP forwarding on the server. To do this, open the sysctl conference configuration file. Find this line and uncomment it to allow the server to forward IPv4 packets between network interfaces. Then, save the changes and exit the configuration file. After saving the configuration file, apply the system settings again so the change takes effect immediately. If the output appears as shown above, it means IP forwarding has been successfully enabled on the server. Okay, the initial preparation steps are now complete. Next, move into the WireGuard server configuration directory. Next, we will generate the key pair for the WireGuard server. This command will create the server's private key and public key, then save them as two separate files in the WireGuard configuration directory. For convenience, we will also generate a key pair for client 1 directly on the server. This key pair will be used to define the client in the server configuration and to create the VPN configuration file for the client device. At this point, you will see 4 key files created, 2 files for the server and 2 files for the client. Next, let's update the permissions for the private key files. Since these are sensitive files used to authenticate the VPN connection, only the owner should be allowed to read and write them. Okay, we have now generated the key pairs for both the server and the client and updated the permissions for the private keys to keep them secure before using them in the WireGuard configuration. Next, display the contents of the keys we just created and copy the required keys into the sample configuration files to prepare for the next configuration step. While copying the keys, make sure to place each key in the correct field in the prepared notes. Specifically, we will save the server public key, server private key, client public key, and client private key for the next configuration steps. Okay, we now have all 4 required keys. Now we will move on to the next step, which is configuring the WireGuard server. First, we will create a new configuration file for the WireGuard server named wg0.conference. Next, open the configuration file we just created so we can start adding the WireGuard server configuration. Then, add the prepared configuration content shown here into the wg0.conference file. Let's quickly go through the parameters in this configuration file. In the address line, we define the VPN IP address for the WireGuard server. Next, we will define the listening port for the WireGuard server. By default, WireGuard commonly uses port 51820, but in this video, I will change it to port 33333. You can use the default port or change it to another port depending on your needs. Next, enter the server private key that we generated and copied in the previous step. This private key is used to identify and authenticate the WireGuard server. Next, these rules allow traffic from VPN clients to be forwarded through the server and access the internet through the VPS public network interface. In the interface_name field, replace it with the actual network interface name we checked earlier. And this is the section where we define the clients, also called peers, that are allowed to connect to the WireGuard server. Each client has its own block, including the client's public key and the VPN IP address assigned to that client. You can define one or multiple clients depending on your needs. An important note is that the VPN IP address defined in the Allowed IPs field for each peer on the server must match the IP address defined in that client's configuration file later. Okay, now copy the entire configuration content and paste it into the wg0.conference file that we just opened. Then, save the configuration content and exit the file. Since this configuration file contains the server's private key, we also need to update its permissions to restrict access from other users on the system. At this point, the WireGuard server configuration file is ready. Now, start the WireGuard server and enable the service so it can automatically run whenever the server restarts. Then, check the status of the WireGuard service to make sure the server has started successfully. If the status shows active, it means the WireGuard server has started successfully and is running on the system. Next, let's check the firewall status on the system. If the firewall is active, you need to allow the WireGuard port so clients can connect to the server. Next, add a rule to allow the WireGuard listening port through the firewall. Here, I configured WireGuard to use port 33333, so I will allow this exact port using the UDP protocol. Okay, at this point, you now have a WireGuard server running on your VPS. However, to connect from a computer or phone to the VPN server, we still need to create the client configuration file in the next step. Now, we will create the first client profile named client1.conference. Then, add the prepared client configuration content shown here into the client1.conference file. In the private key line, enter the private key of client 1 that we generated and copied in the previous step. Next, enter the VPN IP address for the client. This address must match the IP we defined in the peer section of the WireGuard server in the previous step. Next, configure the DNS servers for the client. These DNS servers will be used when the client connects to the VPN. Next, define the public key of the WireGuard server. This is the server's public key that the client will use to authenticate and connect to the correct VPN server. To make the key usage in WireGuard easier to understand, you can think of it this way. The private key stays on the device that generated it, while the public key is shared with the other side for connection configuration. Specifically, on the WireGuard server, we define the server private key and the client public key. On the client configuration file, we define the client private key and the server public key. Next, define the server's public IP address and WireGuard port in the endpoint line. This tells the client which VPN server to connect to and which port to use. And this allowed IPs line defines which traffic will go through the VPN. With the current configuration, all internet traffic from the client will be routed through the WireGuard server. Okay, now copy the entire configuration content and paste it into the client configuration file. Then, save the content and exit the client configuration file. At this point, we have finished creating the client configuration profile. Now, you can generate a QR code from this configuration file to make it easier to import WireGuard on a smartphone. After this step, you will have a .conference file for devices such as laptops or PCs and a QR code for quickly setting up WireGuard on a smartphone. Now, you only need to copy this file to the client device and import it into the WireGuard application to start the VPN connection. To copy the configuration file to your computer, you can use WinSCP to connect to the server and download the client configuration file. With WinSCP, you can easily transfer files between your personal computer and the Linux server using a simple drag-and-drop interface. That's it. We have completed the installation and configuration of the WireGuard VPN server on a Linux server. In the next video, we will learn how to configure WireGuard client on Windows, Linux, and smartphones to connect to the VPN server we just created. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.